Hey, it's Greg here with MaritimeGardening.com, and I recently had a viewer question about wanting a quick and easy refresher on crop rotations for simple crops like beans, potatoes, peas, carrots, tomatoes, onions, and spinach. Hey, I plant all of those things. I like the old school stuff, right? These are the things our grandparents grew, and they're just a great reliable food source, and there's a reason people have grown these things since medieval times, right? They're good go-to crops. So generally speaking, in terms of rotations, what's important is to have a system you can remember. I keep track of these things. Write it down on a piece of paper or have a little document on your computer where you keep track of that. Every year I do a video. I'll put a link to the most recent one at the end of this. Right, it's called the garden plan. I usually do it in January or February, depending on how industrious I'm being in the winter. I tend to get very lazy with this channel and my videos in the dead of winter, and I turn my interests to other things and just take a break from the whole gardening thing. Everything's frozen here, so my interest kind of freezes. Although I still do pump out an article every week on my Substack channel, maritimegardening.substack.com. Anyway, in that video, I usually talk about the principles of crop rotation. And really what you have to think about is what broader categories do those vegetables that you mentioned fit into, right? So you got potatoes, tomatoes, beans, peas, carrots, spinach, onion. And tomatoes and potatoes are in the same family. Beans and peas, they're both nitrogen fixing, so I sort of see them as the same thing. Carrots and spinach are different, and onions or alliums, they're different, okay? So I try to have a system where I never grow the same thing in the same place year after year, and ideally I'd never grow the same thing in the same place maybe once every 4 years or something like that. So let me just show you my garden here. Okay, so here, this is just part of the garden, right? But I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 beds. Whatever I planted in the one there, I plant that same thing in that bed. And I move that one in the next year. Whatever was there goes there the next year. Whatever was there goes there the next year. Right? Last year in this bed I had garlic, and now I've got garlic in that bed. I planted them last fall. Last year that was peas. Now this year this is going to be peas, and so on and so forth. I can't remember that was Swiss chard last year. I'm actually moving the Swiss chard to a different part of the garden, but in principle I could move that down one. Okay, so I just move everything over one, and I try not to have two things that are the same type next to each other. Like I would not have tomatoes and potatoes next to each other, because then because they're the same family, right? They're subject to the same problems, and they want the same. All plants kind of want the same things out of the soil, but of course individual plants, some plants are what they call heavy feeders. They take a lot of nutrients out of the soil, and some plants are actually what they call nitrogen fixing, like peas and beans, where they get their own nitrogen out of the air, and to some extent they actually put nitrogen in the soil. So I tend to like to have a nitrogen fixer in my rotation, right? And I don't like to have two plants of the same type right next to each other, because then let's say I had a tomato here and a potato here, then the tomato would be here the next year. So they will always be following each other, right? So it just increases the risk, right? Because if you have the same thing in the same bed year after year after year, the risk is that some pest or virus or disease or fungi or some problem moves in there and gets established, and that creates a problem. Okay, so that's what I do. But also I have to bear in mind that in this garden here, that's east, that's west. That bed over there, the far right, does not get as much sunlight as that one, and that bed doesn't get as much sunlight as that one. This bed, this bed, this bed, and that one, and the one next to the one with the dome, they all get pretty good light all day long. The one at the far left over there is in the shade in the morning because the sun's rising over there. It's around 10 o'clock a.m. right now, so they're all in the sunlight now, you could see, right? But the one at the far left would have been in the shade a couple hours ago. It wouldn't have got the first sun. So I have to work that into the rotation, where that bed at the far left and the bed at the far right are not good for growing things like tomatoes or peppers that need a lot of sun, right? I mean, I don't know where this person lives, and everybody's situation is different. If you go far enough south and it's hot enough, sometimes a little shade's good. Where I live, shade's never good, right? So I never plant tomatoes or peppers over there. It's just a waste of time. I grow greens there, I grow potatoes there, sometimes I grow beans there or peas. They'll all do just fine over there. Otherwise, I don't, okay? So I have to work that into the rotation. It's just one of those little things you have to, you know, but I've got so many other options, right? See all those beds at the far end over here, okay? So that direction is south, and at certain times of the year the sun's on an angle. So these beds, they look great right now, but they don't tend to get as good sun as the other one. So this bed, that bed, and over there, I never plant squash or beans or tomatoes or peppers because they just don't get as much sun as other beds in my garden. So I tend to grow things like carrots, Swiss chard. That one on the corner is perennials. It's Swiss chard, rhubarb crisp. That's all I make out of it. That's rhubarb over there. But these ones here, this one, and that one, the rotation tends to be potatoes, greens, and something like beets or Swiss chard. That's what I grow. They don't grow as well here as they grow other places in my garden, but they grow and they're productive and they work, right? So that frees up other beds in my garden, which have all good sun all day long, to plant, you know, the things that are very demanding. Okay. Also, I include things like onions and garlic. Some people tuck these things away in corners in their garden. Onions and garlic need a lot of sun. Okay, so you don't tuck them away in a corner. You don't put them on an edge where there's shade. They also need the good sun. I'm just mentioning all of this because if you can't just do a simple mathematical rotation, you have to take into account the sunlight needs of particular plants, right? Plants that need a lot of sun have to go somewhere where there's sun. You still rotate, assuming you've got more than one spot on your property with sun, but you have to take that into account. So for the sake of this viewer's question, this is a simple rotation schedule based on the assumption that every bed gets just as much light as the next. Okay, so again, this is something you have to figure out for yourself, depending on your garden. But you can see I've got it broken up here, and there's a reason these are highlighted. I'll explain that in a minute. But I got something like, let's say you mentioned 7 vegetables. So I've got 7 beds on a 7-bed rotation. Potatoes in one bed, carrots in the one next to it, then onions, then beans, then tomatoes, then spinach, and peas. Okay, so you see how the potato and the tomato are far apart, right? So the next year the potatoes go in the bed where the carrots were, right? And the carrots go where the onions were, right? And the onions go where the beans were, and so on. So it's going to take multiple years, right? Because you had tomatoes in this bed. So it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4 years before the potatoes are growing where the tomatoes were. All right, so it's a pretty good spacing because remember I said potatoes and tomatoes are in the same family. So you got a 4-year break between nightshades. And the onions, which are here, right, they're not going to be grown in the same bed for 7 years, right? They're moving over one bed every year. It's going to be 7 years. So for some of these things, like the spinach, it's on a 7-year rotation. It takes 7 years for the spinach to come back to being in the same bed. I hope you understand this grid. I could do something even fancier using a spreadsheet or something like that, but I think I get the point across here, right? So the vegetables you've got here where there's only one of each kind, they're on a 7-year rotation. And you notice the beans are constantly moving through it. You know, beans really give your soil a break. They put a little bit of nitrogen in the soil, and they're not pulling nitrogen out of the soil. So you got your beans moving through, right? Beans are moving over one every year. And you got your peas, right? The peas were in bed 7 in year 1. Now in year 2, they're in bed number 1. In year 3, they're in bed number 2, and so on. So every 3 to 4 years, the bed's getting a bit of a break with the peas and beans, right? And every year, everything's moving over one. Your carrots are here this year, now they're over here, now they're over here, and so on and so forth. The reason I have these highlighted, the tomatoes and the onions, because these are the vegetables I identify in your list of 7 vegetables as needing really good sunlight. I mean, you can grow these in places with shade, but they'll grow better if you give them all the sun they can take. I mean, just about every, especially potatoes, all these things grow better with lots of sun. But these things will really suffer if they don't have. You'll get really kind of pathetic onions if they're not getting the best sun. And you'll get lousy tomatoes if they're not getting the best sun. So, assuming this bed rotation is all getting the same light, you can rotate it this way. But what if bed number 1 and bed number 7 is in the shade, just like I showed you on my garden? Then you have to think differently about the onions and tomatoes really are just rotating between the inner 5 beds. And you have to do a little bit slightly different pattern, right? They're moving on a 5-bed rotation while everything else in your garden is moving on a 6-bed rotation. This sounds really complicated, but it isn't. And in any given year, you can break the rules and plant the same thing you had the year before. You know, it's not a big deal, right? Right? But if you were planting tomato in the same place every year, you might get away with that, especially if you're adding compost and stuff like that. Or some god-awful disease could move in there and just wreck your tomatoes in a given year. So it's not hard to rotate vegetables. And this looks kind of nerdy and mathematical, but I really don't think it is. If you can play checkers, you can figure this out. Okay, you don't need to understand chess. This isn't chess, this is checkers. Okay. Anyway, just a little refresher on rotating vegetable crops in a garden. It's really not that complicated. Just, I mean, every kind of vegetable is part of a larger family, right? I don't want to give like a biology lecture on all of that. It's easy enough to look up, right? If you look up, you know, your pea and a bean, they're different, but they're both legumes, right? You look up your peppers and tomatoes and potatoes, they're all in the same family, right? They're all related in some way. So think about the bigger, maybe I'll write an article on this. That's the sort of thing that you need to lay out in text form, right? But yeah, you want to look at the bigger family that the vegetables are in and rotate them along that, from that point of view, bearing in mind that some things need lots of light and you just can't put them anywhere. Or you might have a bed that's just really wet, so you can't grow certain things there because, you know, as they say, some plants don't mind having wet feet and some do. So those are things you have to bear in mind too. Within your garden, you've got various microclimates, various growing conditions that may or may not be favorable to everything. So you always have to bear that in mind when you're figuring out your rotations. But other than that, whatever's here, you put it there next year. Whatever's there, you put it there next year, and so on. That's all I really do. It's not that complicated. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, please like, share, subscribe. Check out my podcast at maritimegardening.com. Check out my weekly article at maritimegardening.substack.com. Check out my sponsor, Vessi Seeds, at vessis.com. Use my coupon code GAVS25 for whatever you need in your garden. The details are in the description box, and there's a little blurby thing at the end of this video that explains all of them. Until next time, out there, get at it, have fun in your garden. Thanks for watching.